There is a particular kind of woman that Texas produces and nowhere else quite manages. She is not delicate. She is not decorative. She wakes before sunrise and works past sunset and knows the name of every horse on her property and the weight of every decision on her shoulders, and she carries both with the same unhurried certainty that the land beneath her boots has always been there and always will be. She does not wait to be rescued. She does not wait for much of anything. She decides, and then she does, and the world generally has the good sense to get out of her way. Georgia Calloway was exactly that kind of woman. At 25, she was the sole heir to Calloway land and cattle, 60,000 acres of some of the most productive ranch land in all of central Texas, stretching between the hill country and the Colorado River in a landscape so beautiful it made people who had never believed in anything start reconsidering their position. Her father, Big Jim Calloway, had built the operation from a single inherited parcel and 30 years of decisions made before dawn, and when he passed 2 years ago from a heart that had simply worked itself too hard for too long, he left it all to Georgia with a handwritten note that said 3 words. Don't sell it. She had no intention of selling it. She had every intention of making it bigger. Georgia ran the ranch the way she ran everything, from the front, personally, with her hands in it. She was up at 5 every morning and in the saddle by 5:30 riding a big bay quarter horse named Thunder, who had her father's stubbornness and her mother's heart, and who was, in Georgia's private opinion, the finest animal in the state of Texas. She could read a contract, pull a calf, negotiate a mineral rights agreement, and make a pan of cornbread from memory without slowing down between any of them. Her ranch manager, Darlene, who had worked for Big Jim for 20 years and stayed on out of love for the land and a healthy respect for the daughter, said Georgia was the most competent human being she had ever met and occasionally the most exhausting. Georgia took this as a compliment on both counts. What Georgia did not do, had not done in 25 years of living on this earth, was lose her composure over a man. It was not that she was opposed to the idea in principle. It was that she had a ranch to run and 60,000 acres had a way of filling up the hours that might otherwise go to such things, and beyond that, the men she had encountered in her particular world tended to fall into 2 categories: those who were intimidated by her and those who were interested in the ranch more than the woman running it. Neither category had ever inspired her to rearrange her priorities. She was thinking about neither category on the afternoon in early October when her truck decided to have its own opinion about the state of its fuel system on a 2-lane highway 20 miles outside of Fredericksburg. She had been returning from a meeting with her accountant, which had gone well, the kind of well that comes from a year of hard work expressing itself in numbers on a page the way hard work deserves to express itself. She was in a fine mood. The windows were down. The hill country was doing what it does in early October, which is turn itself gold and copper and amber in a way that makes every other landscape on Earth seem like it is trying too hard. The radio was playing old Waylon Jennings because Georgia had opinions about what constituted acceptable driving music, and Waylon Jennings always made the cut. The truck coughed once, then twice, then rolled to the shoulder with the resigned dignity of a machine that has made its decision and is not interested in further discussion. Georgia sat for a moment. She looked at the dashboard. She looked at the highway, empty in both directions. She checked her phone, 1 bar, barely enough to text, certainly not enough to call with any reliability. She got out, lifted the hood, and looked at the engine with the practical attention of someone who knew enough about engines to know when something was wrong and enough about this particular something to know it was beyond a roadside fix. She was leaning against the grill with her arms folded and her hat pushed back on her head, running through her options, when she heard the motorcycle. She heard it before she saw it, the low easy sound of a well-maintained engine coming from the direction of Fredericksburg, and then it appeared around the long curve of the highway and slowed when the rider saw her truck on the shoulder and slowed further when he saw her, and pulled off behind her with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided to stop before he'd fully processed why. He swung off the bike and pulled his helmet off in one motion, and Georgia Calloway, who had never once lost her composure over a man, felt something move through her chest that she had absolutely no prior reference point for. He was tall in a way that was proportional and certain rather than exaggerated. Dark hair, a little long, the kind that moves in the wind and falls back into place without any apparent effort. A face that had been put together with considerable care, strong jaw, dark eyes that were currently looking at her with an expression of straightforward, friendly concern that was somehow more disarming than anything more complicated would have been. He was wearing a plain gray Henley with the sleeves pushed up and jeans and boots that were the real working kind, not the kind purchased to suggest a life, but the kind produced by one. He raised one hand in the easy greeting of someone with nothing to prove. He said, "Looks like you've got some trouble." His voice was low and unhurried with an accent that was Southern but not specifically Texas, something slightly further east, Georgia thought, Tennessee maybe, or the western edge of the Carolinas. The kind of accent that had been traveling long enough to smooth its sharpest edges. She said, "Fuel line, I think." She said it with the composure of someone who was absolutely in control of the situation and not at all affected by the specific combination of dark eyes and pushed-up sleeves that had just arrived on the shoulder of this highway. He said, "Mind if I look?" She said, "Be my guest." He crouched in front of the engine and looked at it with the focused quiet of someone who knew what they were looking at. He didn't perform the looking. He didn't narrate it or explain it or make it into a demonstration. He simply looked, and then he reached, and then he said, "Yeah, fuel lines cracked right here," and showed her without condescension, pointing to the exact location the way one competent person shows another competent person a thing they have found. She looked. She saw it. She nodded. He said, "I've got some line repair tape in my kit. It's a temporary fix, but it'll get you where you're going. You'll want a proper replacement within a day or two." She said, "You carry fuel line repair tape on a motorcycle?" He said, "I carry most things. Old habit." He went his kit on the bike and came back and fixed the line with the efficient practiced ease of someone for whom this kind of work was as natural as breathing. He didn't make it dramatic. He didn't make her feel helpless for needing it or grateful beyond the ordinary measure of one person helping another on the side of a road. He just fixed it, wiped his hands on a cloth from his back pocket, and said, "Try it now." She started the truck. The engine caught immediately, clean and strong, and she sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the engine running beneath her and something else running through her that she was not yet prepared to name. She got out and looked at him across the hood. She said, "What do I owe you?" He said, "Nothing. I was stopped anyway." She said, "You weren't stopped. You stopped." He looked at her for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, and was considerably more interesting than an outright smile would have been. He said, "All right. You're welcome then." She said, "What's your name?" He said, "Wyatt. Just Wyatt." Offered without elaboration or last name or any of the other information that people in her world generally led with because in her world names carried weight and people knew it and used it accordingly. He offered just the one word and seemed entirely unbothered by whatever she did or didn't do with it. She said, "I'm Georgia." He said, "Nice to meet you, Georgia. You should get that line replaced today if you can." She said, "I know." She paused. "Where are you headed?" He said, "No particular place. Just riding." She looked at him for a moment with the direct assessing gaze she brought to most situations. She said, "Calloway Ranch is about 20 minutes that direction." She pointed west. "I've got a full equipment shop and a mechanic's bay, and I can get you a proper meal while my ranch manager sources the replacement line. Least I can do." He looked at her with those dark eyes for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a practical assessment of the offer required. He said, "All right." He followed her truck down the highway and then down the ranch road and then through the Calloway gate, which was a serious gate made of iron and cedar posts with the Calloway brand worked into the metalwork. And she watched in her rearview mirror as he slowed, slightly taking it in, the gate and the land beyond it opening up in every direction. The fencing and the pastures and the cattle visible in the middle distance and the ranch house sitting on its rise with the hill country rolling away behind it in every shade of gold and green the season had to offer. She parked in front of the equipment barn and got out, and he pulled up beside her and swung off the bike and stood looking at the property with an expression she found herself watching carefully. She had seen many expressions cross many faces when people first saw the full scope of Calloway land. Impressed. calculating, covetous, performatively casual in the way of people trying to hide that they were impressed. His expression was none of those things. He looked at it the way someone looks at something they recognize. Not that they have seen it before, but that it speaks to something in them that already existed before they arrived. He looked at it the way she looked at it herself, which was with a quiet and genuine appreciation that had nothing acquisitive in it. He said, "This is beautiful land." She said, "I know." He helped her replace the fuel line properly in the equipment bay, working alongside her ranch hand Troy without being asked to help and without making Troy feel superseded, simply picking up what needed picking up and doing what needed doing. And afterward, Darlene fed them all at the big kitchen table in the ranch house, cornbread and brisket and sweet tea, and Wyatt ate with the appetite of someone who had been riding a long time and the manners of someone who had been raised right, which Georgia noted and filed alongside the other things she was noting and filing about him and trying not to appear to be doing either. He stayed for 3 hours that afternoon. He fixed a hydraulic issue on the tractor that had been intermittently annoying Troy for 6 weeks, not because anyone asked him to but because Troy mentioned it in passing and Wyatt said he knew what that was and wanted to take a look. He was good with his hands in the way of someone for whom physical competence was not a performance, but simply the natural expression of how they moved through the world. When he said he should get going, Georgia walked him to his bike, and they stood in the late afternoon light that was doing its best October work across the hill country behind the ranch house, and she said, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" He said, "I'll find something in Fredericksburg probably." She said, "There's a guest cabin at the east end of the property. Nothing fancy. But it's got a bed and a bathroom and you're welcome to it if you want to keep heading west tomorrow." He looked at her. She looked back with the steady composure of a woman who had made a practical offer and was entirely at peace with that characterization of it. He said, "I don't want to impose." She said, "I offered." "It's not an imposition if I offered." He stayed. He stayed that night, and the next morning Darlene made breakfast and Wyatt was already in the equipment barn when Georgia came down at 5:30 and they rode the east pasture together in the early morning light, him on one of the ranch horses, a solid gray gelding named Buck who was generally indifferent to strangers and who accepted Wyatt with the easy trust of an animal reading something its rider couldn't yet fully articulate. He could ride. Really ride, not the careful tentative ride of someone who has had lessons, but the deep easy ride of someone who grew up on horseback, balanced and quiet and completely at home in the saddle. She said, "Where did you learn to ride like that?" He said, "My grandfather had land in Tennessee. Small place. About 400 acres. I spent every summer there from when I was 6 until I was 17. She said, "What happened at 17? He said he passed. The land was sold to pay debts." He paused. "It was a long time ago." She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "It was a good place. I'm glad I had it as long as I did." They rode for 2 hours and talked the way people talk when they are on horseback and moving through beautiful land and the morning is clear and there is no particular agenda, which is to say they talked about everything and nothing in a conversation that wandered and doubled back and opened doors and left some of them tactfully ajar rather than fully walked through, because there was time and neither of them was in a hurry. He told her he had been riding for about 2 months. He had come from North Carolina where he had been working for a custom fabrication shop, engineering and design work mostly, and before that various other places and various other work. All of it using his hands and his mind in combinations that suited him even when the circumstances around them did not. She told him about the ranch, about Big Jim, about the note that said don't sell it, and what it had meant to receive it, and what it had cost to honor it in the 2 years since, and what it had given her in return. She told him about the mineral rights negotiations she had navigated and the drought 2 summers ago that had tested every water management system on the property and the fence line project she was planning for the spring that was going to take most of the first quarter's budget, but was the right call. He listened to all of it. Not politely, not waiting for his turn, but with the genuine, engaged attention of someone who found what she was saying interesting because she found it interesting and because he had the particular intelligence that recognizes quality thinking in whatever form it arrives. She found this, without intending to, completely disarming. He stayed 3 days. And then he stayed another 3. The guest cabin at the east end of the property had not been occupied in 2 years and showed no signs of wanting him to leave, and he showed no particular urgency about returning to the road, though he never said as much directly. Which Georgia appreciated because directness about such things too early has a way of making them heavier than they need to be when they are still finding their shape. On the 6th evening they sat on the porch of the main house with sweet tea and the last of the October light dying across the hill country in shades of rose and copper, and he said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "All right." He said, "My full name is Wyatt Callahan Donahue." He said it the way someone says a thing they have been carrying and have decided to set down. "My father is Patrick Donahue. Donahue Construction and Engineering out of Charlotte." He paused. "It's a reasonably large company." Georgia was quiet for a moment. She looked at the horizon. She said, "How large?" He said, "Large enough that I left it 3 years ago because I needed to find out who I was without it telling me." Donahue Construction and Engineering was not a name that required explanation to anyone who worked in land development, infrastructure, or commercial real estate in the southeastern United States. It was one of the most successful family-owned construction and engineering firms on the East Coast, responsible for significant infrastructure projects across 5 states and with a real estate portfolio that the business press covered with reliable interest. The Donahue family was wealthy in the generational architectural way, the kind of wealth that had been accumulating long enough to become simply the backdrop of a life rather than a fact requiring constant acknowledgement. Georgia looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You've been fixing tractors in my equipment barn." He said, "Tractors need fixing." She said, "You slept in my guest cabin." He said, "It's a good cabin." She said, "You fixed my fuel line on the side of a highway and didn't mention any of this." He said, "Your fuel line needed fixing. The other thing didn't seem relevant to that." She looked at him steadily. Then she said, "I appreciate that. More than you know." She paused. "Does it change anything for you? The ranch? The scope of it?" He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes. He said, "No. It tells me you're exactly who I thought you were. Which is a woman who built something real and runs it herself and doesn't need anything from anybody." He paused. "It doesn't change what I want. It just means we're more similar than either of us knew." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need you to be sure about that." He said, "I've been sure since the highway." The kiss happened the following evening on the same porch, unrehearsed and unhurried, the natural conclusion of 2 people who had been moving toward each other for a week with the steady inevitability of 2 rivers finding their confluence. And it was not dramatic, and it was not tentative, and it was completely, entirely right. Darlene, who had seen it coming from approximately day 2 and had been exercising considerable personal restraint about commenting on it, allowed herself one quiet smile in the kitchen and went back to her biscuits. The weeks that followed were the kind that rearrange a person's internal furniture permanently. Wyatt stayed. Not indefinitely stated, not formally decided, just stayed in the way that things stay when leaving has stopped making sense. He integrated into the life of the ranch with the natural ease of someone who belonged to land and work and early mornings and understood the rhythm of a place that ran on weather and seasons and the particular patience of people who have committed to something larger than convenience. He redesigned the irrigation management system using engineering principles that increased efficiency by 30%. He built a proper workshop in the equipment barn that Troy called the best organized workspace he had ever seen in his life. He learned the cattle operation with the methodical intelligence he brought to everything, asking questions that showed he was thinking 3 steps ahead and listening to the answers as though they were the most important information he had ever received. Georgia's board of directors had opinions. There were phone calls from advisors and one memorably uncomfortable dinner with the family attorney Wade Sinclair, who raised the subject of appearances with the careful diplomatic precision of a man who understood he was on thin ice and was trying to walk across it anyway. Georgia listened to Wade Sinclair with complete composure. Then she thanked him for dinner and told him to focus on the mineral rights contract she had given him 6 weeks ago and which was still not finalized. He finalized it within the week. Word got around Fredericksburg the way word gets around small Texas towns. which is to say completely and rapidly, and with a level of editorial embellishment that would have impressed a professional novelist. The stranger on the motorcycle. The Calloway girl. Some people disapproved with the energetic investment of people who disapprove of things that don't affect them. Some people were delighted with equal energy. Most people, when they met Wyatt and watched him work and saw the specific way he looked at Georgia and the specific way she looked back, concluded that whatever reservations they had brought to the subject were going to need to be revised. Wyatt heard the talk. He was not unaffected by it. There was a night in November when Georgia found him standing by his motorcycle in the dark outside the guest cabin with the particular stillness of a man having a conversation with himself that was not going well. She stood beside him without speaking for a moment. He said, "I don't want to be the story people tell about you." She said, "What story?" He said, "The one where the rich rancher's daughter lost her head over a drifter with a motorcycle." She said, "I didn't lose my head. I found my direction. There's a difference." He said, "Georgia." She said, "Wyatt. Look at me." He looked at her. She said, "I've spent 2 years running 60,000 acres alone and making every decision by myself and answering to nobody but the land and my father's memory. I know exactly what I'm doing. I know exactly who you are. And I need you to trust that I am not a woman who doesn't know her own mind." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I know that. I've known that since the highway." She said, "Then stop protecting me from the best thing that has happened to me since my father died." The stillness around them was complete and enormous. Then he reached out and took her hand. They stood there in the dark beside his motorcycle with the hill country silent around them and the stars overhead doing what Texas stars do, which is remind you that you are small and the world is large, and both of those things are fine. He proposed in February, which was not where Georgia had expected it but was, in retrospect, exactly right. They were in the equipment barn on a Saturday morning, working side by side on the hydraulic system of the baling machine, which had been making a noise that neither of them liked. And he handed her a wrench and then did not immediately go back to what he was doing, and she looked up, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone standing at the edge of the most important thing they have ever said and taking the breath before they say it. He said, "I came to Texas without a direction. I found one. I found you. I found land I want to learn and work I want to do and a life I want to build, and I want to build it with you." He reached into the front pocket of his work shirt and brought out a ring, a round diamond in a yellow gold setting, simple and serious and chosen by someone who had been paying close attention. He said, "Georgia May Calloway, will you let me stay?" She looked at the ring, and she looked at him, and she thought about a highway shoulder in October, and a man who fixed her fuel line and didn't mention who he was and ate Darlene's brisket at the kitchen table, and learned the cattle operation, because he wanted to understand what she loved, and built a workshop that made Troy cry slightly when he first saw it, and stood in the dark beside his motorcycle and took her hand. She said, "You were never leaving." He said, "I know. But I wanted to ask properly." She said yes, very properly, with a wrench still in her hand. They were married in May on the east pasture of Calloway Ranch, on the open hill country land with the wildflowers going at full force the way Texas wildflowers do in May, which is with a complete lack of restraint that is either overwhelming or magnificent depending on your disposition, and which was, in this instance, completely magnificent. 200 people came, which was most of Fredericksburg and a fair number of people from Charlotte, including Patrick Donahue, who was a tall silver-haired man with his son's dark eyes and the bearing of someone who had built large things and recognized that quality in others, and who shook Georgia's hand for a long time and said, "My son has been lost for 3 years, and now I understand where he was going." Georgia wore a white dress with her grandmother's pearl buttons and her best boots underneath because she was Georgia Calloway, and some things were non-negotiable. Wyatt wore a dark suit and kept his old motorcycle boots because he was Wyatt Donahue, and he had made the same calculation independently, and they discovered this fact simultaneously when they saw each other at the end of the aisle and both looked down at each other's feet and laughed, out loud, in front of 200 people on their wedding day, which was the most honest and most them thing that could possibly have happened, and which Darlene, who was crying freely in the third row, said later, was the moment she knew without any remaining doubt that everything was exactly right. The vows were their own words. Wyatt said, "I stopped on a highway in October because a woman needed help, and that is the truest and simplest thing I can tell you about why I am standing here. Everything else followed from that one honest moment. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and I am going to spend my life learning this land with you and building something on it that would make your father proud, and I am going to love you every single morning before 5:30 and every single evening after sunset and every complicated and beautiful hour in between." Georgia said, "You fixed my fuel line, and you ate Darlene's biscuits, and you learned my cattle, and you stood in the dark with me, and you handed me a ring in the equipment barn with grease on your hands, and you are everything I didn't know I was patient enough to wait for." I would have said yes on the highway. I think the part of me that knows things already did. The hill country held the moment the way good land holds everything, quietly, permanently, with no drama and no apology. Then the sun went below the horizon in the long, slow Texas way that takes its time and means it, and the lanterns came on across the pasture, and Darlene's catering filled the tables, and thunder stood visible at the fence line of the adjacent pasture with the dignified bearing of an animal who had known about this since October and considered the confirmation overdue. Wyatt did not take over Calloway Ranch. He built his place within it. He established an engineering and design consultancy operating out of the workshop he had built in the equipment barn, taking on land infrastructure projects across the hill country and growing it over 3 years into something substantial and entirely his own. He modernized the ranch's operational systems in ways that saved costs and improved efficiency and earned him the permanent loyalty of every ranch hand on the property. He learned everything Georgia knew about the cattle operation, and then learned things she didn't know yet and brought them back to her, and they argued about them productively over the kitchen table at night the way people argue when they respect each other's intelligence and are not afraid of being wrong. Georgia remained exactly who she had always been. Sharp, competent, unhurried, unreasonably good at everything she put her hands to. The ranch grew. The mineral rights portfolio expanded. The spring fence line project was completed on budget and 2 weeks early, which was the kind of thing that made Georgia Calloway quietly satisfied in a way no headline ever had. But now there was someone on the porch every evening when she came in from the last ride of the day. Someone who handed her sweet tea without being asked and knew when she needed to talk through a problem and when she needed to sit quietly and watch the hill country do its thing and didn't confuse the two. Someone who fixed things. Not just engines and hydraulic systems and irrigation infrastructure. The specific kind of fixing that happens in a life when the right person arrives in it and stays. Years later, a journalist writing a profile on Calloway Ranch asked Georgia what she considered her most significant business decision of the past 5 years. She thought about it. Then she smiled in the way she smiled when something was both true and private. She said, "Stopping for a stranger who stopped for me." The journalist wrote it down and thought she was being poetic. She was being precise. Because the whole truth of it lived on 60,000 acres of hill country land, and in a workshop that smelled of engine oil and cedar, and in a pair of old motorcycle boots standing beside a pair of good riding boots on the porch of the Calloway Ranch house every single morning before the sun came up. And in the fact that Thunder had liked him from the very first ride. Which had been, if Georgia was being completely honest, the moment she had known for certain. If this love story found its way to your heart today, then you are exactly who City of Tales was built for. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, because we are just getting started and the next one is already waiting for you. Drop a comment below and tell us, do you believe in love at first sight? Georgia Calloway didn't either. Until October.